Well, as we come to the end of our week, I want to close by looking at verses 13 and 14 in chapter 10. And those passages read this way. It says, "Wisdom is found on the lips of the discerning, but a rod is for the back of him who lacks judgment." And then verse 14, "Wise men store up knowledge, but the mouth of a fool invites ruin." Now, it's interesting because when you talk about, for example, the mouth of the fool, what we need to understand is what's being implied there. A mouth of the fool is often someone who makes commitments with their mouth. They promise to do things that they are either unwilling or unable to fulfill, and that usually results in them being in loss. And one of the ways that we do that, maybe not verbally, but when we enter into contractual agreements that we aren't able to keep or fulfill. I mean, it's one of those kind of things. I remember when my wife and I were first looking to buy our first house, part of the problem was that we didn't have enough resources to make the payments or the down payment. And so found there were ways that people could get us into a contract, but I couldn't pay the bill. And I would find myself and eventually losing the property. And so we had to wait upon the Lord and pray until God put us in that situation. My dad and mom helped us out to get the down payment and got us into a payment that was low enough that we could afford. But the problem was it could have been easily persuaded into, basically buying something that would have been really an albatross around our neck and made our lives unhappy. And that's why he talks about how you use your mouth. The mouth becomes, in a world where there weren't a lot of written contracts, what you said with your mouth was your bond. People listened to what came out of your mouth and they held you accountable to what you said. Your yea was yea or your nay was nay. You couldn't say yea and then go nay later on, because then people would hold you accountable and there'd be people who witness it. In fact, all of the contractual relationships that took place in the ancient biblical world were usually in the gatehouse. The gatehouse was the entrance to the city. It was also the most fortified. It was built the largest, and that's where they actually held the court cases. In other words, the king would come and sit on his throne, and people would come through the gate and they would sit there before him and he would pass judgment. And so the elders would sit in the gate of the city. But the point was that whatever transactions took place were not necessarily written down. In fact, they rarely were. Whatever transactions took place were heard by all those who were witnesses of that transaction. And so we have a good example of that in the book of Ruth when Ruth's husband, when Ruth's husband goes to the gatehouse and makes this vow that he will take her as his wife. So, these kind of things are important to us to understand when it uses these terms like the mouth of a fool or the lips of the discerning and so forth. It's talking about how that the words that you say will be held by other people in their memory banks so that you will be accountable. So when somebody makes a promise to do something and they don't do it, then they are guilty of breach of contract. And there are other people who are around to witness that. And so it's something that we lose sight of, because now we can write contracts where we can have all sorts of stealthy and slimy language. And I don't know if you've ever read many legal contracts. It's a whole language unto itself. But I mean, it's amazing to me how there is so much to read. You have to have a lawyer many times read through it and make sure that there's not being a trap set someplace in there or something that's unacceptable. But the whole thing is that when you're talking about somebody who is wise, that wisdom is found in the lips of the discerning. In other words, people who understand things are able to recognize traps and hazards that may not be obvious to you or me. And I think that's what it means to be discerning. Wisdom is the ability to see through the folds and the layers and the complexities. For me, one of the things is wisdom comes out if I can look at a passage and really begin to understand what exactly is that passage trying to say to me. In fact, one of the reasons I decided to teach through the book of Proverbs is because I had so many people who would tell me over the years, I read it, but I don't understand a lot of it. And that's because it's oftentimes written in a textual, a colloquial kind of way that you had to kind of be there to know that what they were saying. But as we begin to study the culture and the background, the history, and the dynamics in which these teachings took place, these words were expressed, it begins to make more sense. And we find that we can begin to transfer those principles into the way that we live our life on a day-to-day basis. So when we talk over and over again about having wisdom, you know somebody has wisdom if they can look at a situation, or even, as I found, I was talking with a gentleman who has helped me to discern some contractual arrangements that I'm involved in. And as he was going through, he's saying, this is what this means and this is what that is, so that I fully comprehended what I was agreeing to, what I was getting myself into. And that's where he says wisdom is able to discern that. It's able to see through all those layers and there's folds. And, I would just simply say to anybody that if you're going to go into any kind of a contractual agreement of any kind, whether it's to buy a car or a house or a job or any number of things that you can be contracted with today, that you have somebody with some wisdom and experience take a look at it so that they can tell you what exactly is in it, because we live in that kind of dishonest world today where people will take advantage of us if they can because it's to their gain. And that's why you want to be somebody who not only uses wisdom, but you rely upon the lips that are discerning and you listen to those people. And that's where a lot of times we learn in life. There are people whom we can listen to and their advice is always sound. And there are other people whose advice is well intended, but it's often really does reveal that they don't really understand the full dynamics of what they're suggesting. I mean, I've had people over the years come to me with all sorts of advice. You guys should do this and you guys should do that. And I've just waited on the Lord. And eventually God brings somebody into my life who I say, what do you think about this idea? And that person says, well, here's my experience. And they begin to break it all down. And I realize this is not something I want to do. Thank you for the recommendation. Thank you for the advice. But it's not right for me. I don't tell the person that there's bad for promoting it or suggesting. I'm just saying it's just not the right decision for me, because there are so many layers and complexities to many of these decisions that unless you're allowing wise people and lips that are discerning look at it and communicate with you, you probably end up making a decision that's not in your best interest. Now, especially if they're wanting to sell something, almost always, if they're wanting to sell something, it's going to be a great advantage to them and not necessarily or so much to you. But again, when he goes and says that a wise man stores up knowledge, you see, as we learn stuff, we have experience. And so wise men are people who are experienced with life. When I was younger, a young man, I was not a wise man. Now, I wasn't stupid, I wasn't foolish, and I a lot of times did okay because I really prayed about decisions that I had to make, and I also waited upon the Lord, as I talked about, and I also counseled with people who were more mature and more experienced, and whom, by experience, I had come to realize were objective in their advice. And those people who would recommend that I do what Scripture says and didn't recommend I do non-scriptural things became the people I listened to more closely. And I'm forever thankful for those people because they helped guide me in the right paths. But what you find is as you walk those paths, you start storing up knowledge. You begin to have perspective. You begin to saying, I've been here. I know this is what it's all about. And I know where this will lead. And I know whether something good could come of it. I know whether something bad could come of it. The fool, in contrast, says he invites ruin. The fool sees something that he thinks is advantageous and he races towards it because he's driven by selfish ambition and greed. And so he just pours himself into getting a hold of whatever it is that he wants to get a hold of. And he ends up doing so to his own hurt. So one of the things I've found is kind of a general rule in my life: haste does make for waste. If there's not time to really pray and wait upon the Lord, then you're probably going to leap into something that isn't in your best interest. Now, I believe, and I've said this many times, if God has something for me, then he's going to keep it for me, and he's not requiring me to make my decision all of a sudden. I had remember early in my ministry, a guy was trying to sell us a copier for our office, and he called me up and he was saying, I can give you a great deal. I get 20% off if you buy this copier today, and we can ink that deal. And I said, well, I just have to pray about it. And I said, I'll just wait on the Lord, seek the Lord, pray about it, and I'll let you know what I decide. And then he says to me, I tell you what, I'll give you 30% off if you pray right now. I said, thank you for your generous offer, but I'm still going to wait. And I thought, he's pushing me to do this. And I just knew somehow this is, first of all, probably something I don't need. And this is also somebody who I don't want to be in business with. And so bottom line is I ended up passing up that great deal. Well, I pray that you have a great weekend as you gather with family and friends and worship together. And I pray that you'll allow your Sunday to be a day of rest, a day in which you step away from the busyness of everyday activity and really seek the Lord and just allow God to be gracious to you and minister your heart. God bless you and go in his goodness.